So, Preston, we have the sequel to that Reddit post last time where someone went to the Cushing Library in Texas and they found some old George R. R. Martin notes and ideas and drafts about what the story could have been. And someone hit me up with it and they sent it to me and I'm like, oh, this sounds juicy as hell because there was at one point in time, Victarion Greyjoy was going to die. So I had to bring it to you. You read the whole thing.
Yeah.
What's going on?
I did. Well, first off, again, just props to gsteff who did this, who did this research. This is the most new, interesting stuff we have about the story that we've gotten in years, and it couldn't have happened without just painstaking work. So really, just props. But let's get into some of the interesting stuff here. So what gsteff was looking at was an early draft of A Feast for Crows. And when we talk about an early draft for A Feast for Crows, what we mean is the draft before it got split into A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, and it was still a singular book. And there's a couple in the writing process. You have to remember that first, George R. R. Martin believed that he was going to have a 5-year gap, and then he believed it was. Then he abandoned that, but he still thought it was going to be one book, and then he abandoned that and split the books up. It's interesting because some chapters from A Dance with Dragons that we didn't read for years, George had actually written, years before because he'd done it for A Feast for Crows. And then, but then a lot of changes can happen to it and stuff like that. So some of these chapters are very old, but some of them deal with Jaime's adventures, or Victarion and Slavers, arriving in Slavers Bay and actually, his plans for Victarion arriving in Slavers Bay, but Daenerys as well, what was going on with Daenerys. And what gsteff found here in this entry has to do with the Daenerys chapters, some Jaime stuff, and the Victarion chapters. And it's yeah.
Before we started, you said there was something juicy involving Jon?
Yes. So it involves Dany. So there was a big, interesting evolution of the Daenerys chapters in A Dance with Dragons. They were changed quite a bit. You had the 5-year gap abandonment. You had the story split, the book split, and then you had the Myronese knot eventually coming in. And all of these things reshaped the Daenerys story, and it was rewritten many times.
Jesus.
Yes. And I have mixed feelings about the Daenerys story from A Dance with Dragons. Many people's, it's their least favorite part of the book. But I will say that there is a lot of interesting consistency and a lot of Easter eggs going from one chapter to the next that you don't necessarily see in all point of views. It's not like when you read Tyrion 7, you're harking back to Tyrion 2. While with Daenerys, you are. The only other chapters that are kind of comparable in those sorts of Easter eggs going back to previous chapters would probably be Jon and Theon, where something that happens in the first or second chapter is being brought up, these tiny details. And so there's all these little details in the background of the Daenerys story in A Dance with Dragons that are very interesting. You can tell whole stories based on other characters going on in the background. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the Daenerys story came out well, but it George definitely worked hard on it, and there's a lot of detail to it, and a lot of changes went to it. And so what gsteff kind of discovered here, researching an early draft of Dany, is we kind of knew that from previous interviews and reports and stuff, that we kind of knew that before the 5-year gap was abandoned, the reopening of the fighting pits happened very early in Daenerys' story. If not Daenerys 2, I think, was when it was supposed to happen, rather than Daenerys, 12? Or is it Daenerys? It's way, it's the second to last chapter, right, for Daenerys in A Dance with Dragons. And so many people thought, okay, well, the previous belief was, okay, I guess she was picked up by Drogon and exited really early. And because the 5-year gap was abandoned, this entire story had to kind of establish what Dany was doing and ruling Meereen, rather than it happening off page with the 5-year gap. But that's what gsteff discovered, is that's not actually the case. Is that the pits were opened in the old story, but she wasn't carried off by Drogon.
Oh,
she flew around with him. Drogon picked her up with his talons, which is claws, flew around, and then she was back in the city ruling. And it's so the fighting pits were opened, but she didn't actually leave yet, which kind of shifts everyone's like super fans like ideas of what George was writing. And now keep in mind, George abandoned all of this, so like, even he got stuck on what he thought Daenerys should be doing and started over. So,
wait, so he just picks her up and they fly around the city for what's the reason for that? Just to show power?
I guess, or like the idea is that she's now bonding with the dragon and that she's now becoming like a dragon queen, and like how that affects people's like mindset, that she's like bound to this dragon. Like, and she actually describes in her monologue like that, actually even talking to somebody, that she is now like, she and her dragon are now one. So it's definitely like, more of that, how we were talking about with House of the Dragon, like Daemon being hit and the dragon feeling the pain and that kind of stuff. There was definitely more of that like discussion. Now, the follow-up chapter to the fighting pits used to be Daenerys 3, which is when Xaro comes from Karth and talks to Dany, and it's this random scene where they're having a dinner and there's like naked dancers. Daenerys 3 is one of my least favorite chapters in A Dance with Dragons. And it's not that it's poorly written, but it has nothing to do with the other chapters. It really it sticks out like a sore thumb if you read the Daenerys story. Like, there's all these little references.
Is that the one where he doesn't look at her breasts? He doesn't take a peek?
Yeah, he doesn't look at her breasts, but he's instead looking at like naked dancers. And, she pisses off Karth. Like, Karth like offers her some ships, and she pisses off Karth, and the Karth decides to join the war against, or, decides to blockade Slaver's Bay. The events aren't that important because anyone could have done that blockade. It didn't need to be Karth. It doesn't really even make sense that it's Karth, because Karth is really far away. They don't even send many ships, which kind of contradicts like a Clash of Kings where Karth has hundreds and hundreds of ships, and all of a sudden they send like, a handful to do a blockade. Plus, like, there's just no references to all of the little Sons of the Harpy activity that is sprinkled in all the rest of the chapters. It's my least favorite of the Daenerys chapters. But what's interesting is that it's one of the oldest, that it was reworked, that George took paragraphs and chopped them around and stuff like this and changed the plot around. And the reason that Daenerys 3 sticks out as this chapter that doesn't do anything and is kind of irrelevant, like if I were to cut a single chapter from A Dance with Dragons, I might make it Daenerys 3. Like, there's just no point to it. Like, it doesn't need to be there. Well, John 2 is also horrible, because that's the one that doubles from the Samwell chapter. But
well, you say that, yeah. but Daenerys 3, if it mostly spends time with her and Xaro, mm-hmm. and she pisses off Karth, you firmly believe that she's going to go back to Karth at some point. So wouldn't that make more sense? Wouldn't that harken back to this chapter eventually?
I guess, hopefully. But I mean, I think it's more important that Daenerys goes back to Karth to talk to Quaithe, not that she talks to Xaro. Like, her meeting Xaro again isn't really very important to, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, Xaro is a fine character. I like his character. I like the character. And his character shines in that chapter, but the chapter is irrelevant. It just doesn't add anything really to the story. So it's really interesting that it's like this older chapter that was there. And like completely reworked. So, but yeah, there's definitely some like lines that were there, because I think she's telling Xaro about her dragon bond, and she's like, "I'm the blood of the dragon. I have no fear of Drogon," and things like this. She like innately like she explicitly like tells what Drogon was doing. She says like, my life was in peril. Drogon must have sensed it, and that's why he returned and attacked everyone. Like stuff like this. Like she's explicitly like telling people about her dragon bond and why Drogon came back and like why he was killing people. That it was some sort of like, you know, mental link with her. So it's George improved on things by making it more subtle on what was going on or making things a mystery. So, some other interesting things about the fighting pit scene. The fighting pit scene happens and the locusts are there. And Strong Belwas still loves the locusts and chows down on the bowl. However, the locusts aren't poisoned. There's no reference to the locust being poisoned. No one offers Dany any locusts. Like in the chapters after it, Belwas is not poisoned. So it's really quite funny that like the locusts were there and only like because George went back and started reading stuff and was like, oh, maybe I could make these locusts poisoned, does he add it in. Also in the original draft, most of the lines of Hisdar are given to Reznak. That Hisdar is like just less of a character and Reznak is more of a character. And when George rewrote, he just transferred the lines of Reznak to Hisdar to make Hisdar a bigger character. But yeah, it's kind of funny that the poisoned locusts thing, like he had the locust there and he had Strong Belwas loving locusts. And then he just like, but there was no poison originally. And he just like added that later on. So that was kind of funny.
Didn't we have this conversation last time about, like, you don't believe Dany was poisoned and that Strong Belwas just, I guess the locust didn't agree with his stomach?
I mean, you're kind of right that, like, that knowing that originally there was no poison and he just had the scene of Strong Belwas chowing down on locusts, and then he kind of retroactively needs to throw poison in there. But at the same time, he doesn't want to kill Strong Belwas. It does make me rethink my Locusts of Marines series, just because I don't know if George like really thought through the logic of the scene. You know, like because he already had written the scene of events that needed to happen, and then he like retroactively throws poison in there, and so it's like going and looking at the details of, say, like how many locusts somebody eats is like not something that's really relevant, considering it was like a fully written scene before the poison was even added. But yeah, it's kind of interesting in that sense. The other thing that was kind of interesting is, so you know how in A Dance with Dragons, Hisdar has a trial of, he has to achieve peace for 90 days. And if he achieves peace for 90 days, he gets to marry Dany. Originally, Hisdar was going to be given 3 trials. He had to achieve peace for 20 days. He had to achieve peace at sea. And then she reserved a 3rd one that she hadn't decided on giving him. That was going to be near impossible. And Missandei is like, so you don't actually want to wed him. Because she's like, maybe it's going to be like, I'll have him fly a dragon or something like that, or something. And Missandei is like, oh, so you don't really want to marry him? And he's like, no, if he like achieves it, I'll marry him. But like, you know, it's going to be hard. And so there's no hint, like George never gets to the point where a 3rd trial is ever created, or, you know, or maybe he didn't know. And that's one of the reasons he like abandoned it. But he originally was going to have more trials for Hisdar to get through in order to marry Dany.
Well, the trials seemed like they would have added more chapters to this already, because
yes, they would. Yeah,
would have made this a bit longer.
And then there's a very small House with the Red Door Lemon Gate change that's in there. But it's very, very, very small. So in the original text, there's a line in Dany's story that says, in Braavos there had been a house with a red door, but that was all. And the line originally was, in Bravos, there had been a house with a red door, but only for a little while. It's a very, very slight change, but only for a little while, but that was all. And it's hard to say what's going on there. gsteff thinks like it's a shift to a tad more ambiguity, but and that's the whole, George was trying to add just a little bit more mystery to the house with the red door. But both lines are kind of weird. Like in Bravos, there had been a house with a red door, but only for a little while. So
you could take that in so many ways. Like, did she live in Bravos just for a little bit, or maybe she lived in Bravos but
longer,
they moved from house to house, or did they change the door? Like, you could take that so many ways.
Yeah, I know. And changing it to, but in Bravos there had been a house with a red door, but that was all. Like, both lines are pretty weird and ambiguous, right? Yeah. In general, though, what gsteff noticed is that George likes to go back and make his writing more concise, and most of the writing are like making writing more concise, smaller, taking up less space on a page. And then
that must suck for George, because you can tell he wants to like expand this, but the story has gotten away from him.
Yeah.
Like, it really has, to the point where he has to split it into 2 books and all that. And like you said it years ago, and it's still relevant now. There's no way he could finish it in just 2 books. And even with this, Yeah,
but there's also just like weird ways to like reshape sentences in order to like cut out the number of words and stuff like that. Proving worthy he drew the sword from the stone is a lot shorter than he approached the stone and pulled out the sword, and in doing so showed himself to all that he was worthy. Like, that's like you can take long sentences like that and shorten them, and George does that a lot to try to fit everything, fit everything in. So, there's one other thing. There is a mental sex scene that Dany has where she has sex with Hisdar, but he's kind of like an other, and his like penis is made of ice. Do you remember that?
Kinda, but it's been so long.
The original is beneath her coverlets, she tossed and turned, dreaming that Hisdar was kissing her, but his lips were blue and bruised. And then he thrust himself inside her. His manhood was as cold as ice. She sat up with her hair disheveled and her bedclothes a tangle. Now, most people read this and they think, oh gosh, like Dany's having a nightmare about the others. Like, who would have like a penis like that's like ice? Which, obviously that's supposed to be one of the many ways to take it. But the original version, because some people also think like, okay, maybe it's not Hisdar. Maybe the person is with the blue lips is really like Euron, and maybe she's having like a nightmare about him. But I think in the original version, and gsteff points this out, and I agree, it's actually more clear that the person is Jon. I know, because Jon is dead. And so he's going to be cold. His lips are going to be cold as ice because he like dies. And the thrust inside her is rather than it being just his penis, because dicks are swords and swords are dicks, it's Jon killing her at the end, right? Like what we saw at the end of Game of Thrones. So in the original version, it's not Hisdar kissing her, it's Daario. So Daario is kissing her, his lips blue and bruised. He thrust inside her. His manhood was cold as ice. She sat up. And then, my queen, said a voice in the darkness. Dany flinched, imagining pale skin, blue lips, a twisted blade. Who's there? So, like, in this situation, like, he's being a little more explicit that the dick is a sword, right? He mentions the dick and he mentions the sword before he just mentions the dick. And, like, it's, so here, like, oh, maybe she wasn't actually getting stabbed by a dick. She was getting stabbed by a sword. Now, all of a sudden, the scene seems a lot more like the ending of a Game of Thrones. I mean, the ending of Game of Thrones, the series. Like her getting stabbed by Jon, a person who's cold and dead with blue and bruised lips, and stuff like that. So, rather than her actually being, having sex with an ice penis. So Daenerys 7, she's having sex with Daario in the morning. She gets married to his Dar, and she has sex with him at the end. She gets married and has sex with him at the end, but somehow, somewhere in the middle, she has a dream about about having sex with his Dar. And in the original, it was Daario, because apparently, it doesn't matter if it's Daario or his Dar, because they're the red herring. Because it's really about somebody else. It's really you're supposed to be thinking about the others, but the true answer of who it is it's probably Jon. And I've heard theories that it was Jon. But this, I would say, there being a twisted blade, in the original version kind of confirms for me that, that was definitely the reference, that she was really dreaming of Jon killing her in that chapter. Let's see what else. Oh, right. So, some people have noticed this because there are previous readings of George's chapters from years ago. I think a 2005 reading. So a lot of people had noticed. There's in an early version. There's rather than when Quaithe lists the people coming to meet Dany, she says in A Dance with Dragons that the people coming are Crow and Kraken, Lion and Griffin, the son of the sun, and the Mummer's Dragon. Remember the Undying, beware the perfumed seneschal. In the published version, it's Kraken and Dark Flame, Lion and Griffin, the sun's son, and the Mummer's Dragon. The original, it's Crow and Kraken, Lion and Griffin, the son of the sun, and the Mummer's Dragon. So the big thing being Kraken and Dark Flame being changed for Crow and Kraken. And there's a reason for this, and that is, and gsteff really finds it, is some people theorize Crow and Kraken, did that refer to Euron and Victarion heading instead of Kraken and Dark Flame, which is Victarion and Makoro, So Crow and Kraken, why would Euron be coming to Slaver's Bay? And apparently this was the original version. So what gsteff found is that originally Euron doesn't leave Victarion behind, doesn't stay behind in Westeros and send Victarion off. The two of them go together to Slaver's Bay. And Euron is along for the trip. And this is why the original version said Crow and Kraken. Euron was really heading to Slaver's Bay. Now, this is what's kind of crazy. Okay? Because what gsteff found is not only was Euron and Victarion heading to Slaver's Bay, Victarion was supposed to die. And he finds this in one of the chapter placeholders of a chapter that's supposed to come in the future. George lists a Victarion chapter and puts parentheses, Victarion dies. Now, some people might think, okay, well, this is kind of weird. If Victarion dies, who's the point of view to view all of the events of Euron? And the answer is Aeron, because Aeron is the stowaway aboard is captive aboard the ship. That Victarion would die, and Aeron would take over as the point of view to view Euron. Now, you may think
wow, okay.
Yeah. Now, what I think is most interesting about the fact that Euron, that Victarion dies, is that Dany has a vision in the House of the Undying of a guy with gray lips smiling sadly on the prow of a ship. And this vision clearly comes true in the Victarion sample chapter. And it's Victarion, clearly. However, it's very clear that originally George meant that vision to be Euron. But then Euron isn't coming to Slaver's Bay, so he switched it to Victarion. That he could take that George purposely switched what one of the visions of the House of the Undying was. That his original plan was supposed to be Euron, and he changed it to Victarion. So I think that's pretty.
I wonder why he made the change. Maybe because Dany's vision in the House of the Undying and George needed Victarion to be that guy, or maybe because he has bigger plans for Euron in Old Town.
No. I think he didn't kill off Victarion because, as he wrote Victarion, Victarion just became an awesome character, and like it became an awesome story. I think that's more it. He definitely had he just changed his mind because Victarion, as you go through Victarion, the Victarion story just gets better and better. And I could imagine George being on a roll, being like, oh crap, like I really like this, and like not wanting to kill off Victarion anymore. But it's
so originally Euron wasn't going to go raid the Reach. He was going to go to Meereen and try to court Dany.
So the Reaver chapter still happens. So the Reaver chapter, which was originally entitled the King's Brother, is a chapter that was fully written. And that chapter, which was written very early, has very few changes to it. So the Ironborn chapters of A Feast for Crows are the earliest written chapters of the story, and they go through whatever George did. Like he went to the editors and did everything and cleaned them up. They're pretty much like from verbatim the same up to the Reaver, and then. The stuff that happens after that, like the Dance with Dragons Victarion chapters, haven't been written yet. But like all the Feast for Crows chapters were pretty much the same. So the raiding of the Shield Islands and going up the Mander, that was definitely a real thing. That was part of the plan. But then Euron was gonna fuck off to Slaver's Bay, like and essentially abandon the Ironborn, all the other Ironborn to like get killed. And he would just come back with dragons or something, was his plan. So I don't know what the point of the Reaving was, to give. I guess the point was to get elected or something, and then go, and then leave. And the Reaving was what he promised everybody, so he had to give it to them, I guess.
Well, I would assume he would go raid the Reach and get all this bounty, all this boon, and then go sail to Meereen and offer her lavish gifts from Westeros, because besides ships, what else can he really offer her?
Right. I mean, I suppose he could steal some wealth or something, some plunder, right before he goes. But yeah, no, Victarion was supposed to die. Euron was supposed to go to Slaver's Bay. Aeron was supposed to go to Slaver's Bay. Euron was clearly the House of the Undying vision, but it got changed to Victarion. Yeah. So that's pretty.
Okay, so
interesting.
so Dany's has changed around. Victarion is almost non-existent after a while. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So,
and then there's Jaime chapters. Now what's kind of funny is that so Jaime chapters. There was a plot in the Jaime story that was completely abandoned. And that was Kevin Lannister went missing. and
was he last seen a horse? What happened?
He just like throughout the Jaime story, for some reason, like characters are mentioning like, oh, have you seen my uncle? And everybody's like, no, I haven't seen him lately. Isn't he at Derry? No, I didn't see him at Derry. Oh, okay. Like just like, and then it just kind of goes on like this, right? And all of that kind of was cut. It's very weird. There is some explanation, and that is the Jaime story and the Brienne story seem to have been more separated, and that it may have been that Kevin was the hostage that the Brotherhood Without Banners had, rather than Brienne. There are some weird things, like when Jaime arrives at Castle Derry, there's like a line like, of his uncle Kevin he saw no sign, nor of Lancel. Only a maester emerged to greet him, and you're like, and there's a bunch of like random mentioning, like he says, will I find my uncle here? And they're like, no, my lord, Sir Kevin took leave of us after the wedding. Like like Jaime 4 is filled with all of these mentions of Kevin and he actually asks, like in Jaime 5, like he arrives somewhere and he's like, oh, have you seen Sir Kevin? Aye, he passed away here heading west. Like there's all these mentions of like, where's Kevin, that have nothing to do with the story. They have nothing to do with the story, right? Like, and they're all just this relic of the fact that there was a Kevin gets kidnapped by the Brotherhood without banners, and that went away. You know, that was just kind of eventually a plot that George cut.
Does it mention that the Brotherhood is still led by Lady Stoneheart at this point, or
yes.
Stoneheart?
All that's there. So Lady
okay.
Stoneheart's there. But the interesting thing about the Jaime plot as well is, so there is a very small, very obscure theory that, so there's this one sex worker that Jaime runs into when he goes to treat between, like, where he goes to negotiate between the Brackens and the Blackwoods. And keep in mind that Jaime 1, A Dance with Dragons, was written very early. And so it's kind of funny that, like, George had finished that chapter for the only Jaime chapter in A Dance with Dragons. He'd finished that chapter like back in 2004, you know, way early, before most of A Feast for Crows was even written. He had finished like the Jaime story. And then he decided to like cut that chapter from A Feast for Crows and pop it into A Dance with Dragons. So Jaime goes to, he's at Pennytree and the situation between the Blackwoods and the Brackens. And he walks in to Titus Blackwood's room, and he's with a sex worker named Hildy, and it's, Hildy is named and gets a lot of attention, so it's a little suspicious, but she's just a random character, right? And so there's a random theory that, like, wait a minute, how did the Brotherhood without banners know where Jaime was? Like, at the end of the story, when Brienne shows up, how did she find Jaime? You know? And it doesn't quite make sense. Like, the Brackens are on his side, so they wouldn't be, like, squealing to the Brotherhood. And the Blackwoods were under siege, so they couldn't. So who could possibly tip off the Brotherhood without banners onto Jaime's location so that Brienne could show up to meet him? And so the theory was, well, Hildy is an agent for the Brotherhood without banners. It's a very small, obscure theory that existed. And, one of those theories where you're like, okay, I guess so. Like, no one has any horse in the race. No one has any dog in the fight. So everybody's just like, okay. But like, it turns out this obscure theory about Hildy being a Brotherhood without banners plant is completely true. Because in the original story, Brienne doesn't show up to tell Jaime that he has to come with her. It's Hildy.
Wait, what?
Yeah, that the entire ending of the story is not Brienne but Hildy.
Okay, so let's unpack here.
Yeah.
As cool as it would have been for Kevin to have been kidnapped by the Brotherhood without banners, we went through this last time with the Dance of Dragon chapters. I still like him being killed by Varys at the very end better.
Oh yeah. But it is true now that like because I went back once I read about like the relics of like Kevin in A Feast for Crows, I was like, really? And then I looked through the Jaime chapters, I was like, oh my god, he talks about Kevin just a whole bunch, like just an unnecessary amount of time is spent like talking about Kevin and Kevin's location, considering that like he plays no role until the epilogue, right? Like, like he's kind of at the beginning in King's Landing where he talks to Cersei and she asks him to come and be Hand, and he's like, no. And then he vanishes and he's not part of the story. And then he's in the epilogue, right? And, it's just, he was apparently there was like an original kidnapping plot that he was going to be like the reason that Jaime needed to to like go meet the Brotherhood or something, you know. So it's kind of funny,
Okay, but so what does Brienne do? So does she still run into the Brotherhood or no?
Well, that's the funny thing is it's hard to say. It's hard to say like when he abandons these plots and when he decides to do changes. What I can say is that the Brienne plot is one of the tightest, most well written stories that he has. So it's really amazing to think that she wouldn't be running into the Brotherhood, you know? So it may be that like they both would have separate Brotherhood plots, you know? Then again, there are two factions of the Brotherhood without banners, so that might be an issue too, you know. So there's the Lady Stoneheart faction, but then there's the Beric Dondarrion faction still exists. So, you know, so.
Well, what about the Bard, who's like a Brotherhood without banners agent who's there, like kind of spying on Jaime and what the Lannisters are doing? Like, is that still in there?
No. The Thomas Seven stuff is still there, but. Like, all the Thomas Seven stuff is still there. Thomas Sevens is still... And Jaime, when he goes to River Runs, talks about how the sex workers seem to be infiltrating the camp and things like this, and no one's taking them seriously, and there's not much security going around. So it's not that, you know, a reader should know that every sex worker is potentially a Brotherhood without banners plant. But... So like the Hildy theory makes complete sense. It's just but it's also like one of those small things. Like, how did the Brotherhood know where Jaime was? Well, that's also a small enough issue that it's also something that an author could just not think about, and it being an oversight. You know, like it could be a small plot hole. Like it's something that no one thinks about. But it turns out it's not a plot hole. That like Hildy really was a Brotherhood plant, and that she tipped off the Brotherhood on where he was.
Okay, so are there any more? So we have Dany, Victarion, Jaime.
Yeah, the Dany stuff, the Victarion stuff, and the Jaime stuff are the big changes. Yeah.
Well, is there going to be any more to this? Because what's going on? I know we did part 1 a while ago. This is part 2. Is there going to be a part 3? And is part 3 going to be bigger? What's going on with the progress of these?
What gsteff says is because. There was something said. Let's see. Next time I'll be covering the remaining point of views for which I found substantial differences in the Cushing drafts, including perhaps my biggest discoveries. Stay tuned for Cersei, Tyrion, and Jon.
Okay, cool. Very nice. And of course, shout out to gsteff, by the way, for going there and doing this. I said this last time, how I was amazed that people are just allowed to go in here and check out George's stuff. Some dipshit in the comments was like, well, Carmine, that's how a library works. Yes, I know that, you idiot. It's just, like, I'm surprised that George's previous personal, private, like, writings are available to the public, because you always have people coming in with, like, sticky, dirty fingers and whatnot, and, like, I don't know, personally, if I was a writer and I was, you know, had some stuff that I didn't use before, I would keep that under lock and key, and I feel like a lot of writers would as well. But, no, props to George for making this available to the public so people can go and see it.
Yeah, it's just really fun, like, going through and what could have been, what might have been, you know, and seeing when George takes something obvious and makes it more subtle and stuff like that. So it's fun. It's fun to go through it.
I do have 2 questions for you before we wrap it up. The first question is, does this change any theories you've already done going forward?
I guess it does, in the sense that, like, the ending of Game of Thrones really does seem like it was George's original plan. I'm not saying it's George's plan now, but it really does seem like Game of Thrones was hitting the major plot points of the book. And you know, Jon killing Dany, is something that totally was going to happen, you know, and that was a plot point. And like the more you kind of go through stuff and you're like, well, that happened in the show. It looks like this evidence shows that this is probably what George was planning, you know. And so I think in that sense, you know, it's another thing where I go, oh no, that's the show. The show really was like, George did really reveal everything to them, and that's what they put on screen. You know, the plot points, at least, not the how you get there. But other than that, I'm trying to think if anything that really like changes too much besides that's the only one that really changes any of my and maybe the honeyed locust thing where I'm like, like to George really, was he really thinking about it that carefully? But other than that, I mean, I don't think much theory changes. It's just kind of an interesting thing seeing these like relics and how things changed and stuff like that. Yeah, that's about it. It's just that, George does, make major changes and is fine with making major changes, like keeping Victarion alive, changing the House of the Undying vision, and who it refers to and stuff like that. So George is willing to make these big changes.
My second question is, will you take any of this information going forward to doing your fan fiction?
I mean, I'll probably like when we get to Jaime chapters, like make sure that Hildy gets mentioned. Maybe some little things like that. But other than that, it might help with stuff. But I can't think of anything major that would change. I guess the big thing is whether or not like, I really want to like keep John.
You should probably hold off until we get the third part of this.
Yeah, that's true. But I've always also like struggling with the fact that like I know that George meant for John to be resurrected, but I don't want to resurrect him, and so I just don't know what to do with that. So it's like against like George's like ideas. At what point does the story just veer into a new direction? I mean, it already has. Like we're already doing stuff that George probably didn't think of. So who knows? So we'll see. It's fun nonetheless. It doesn't,
That's fair. But yeah, no, this one was, I would argue this revelation was better than the last one from gsteff, and part 3 sounds even better. So we will keep you up to date as soon as these come out. But as always, I'm sure Preston will leave the link so you guys can read it for yourself down below in the description. Preston, is there anything else you wanted to discuss from this post?
No, I think we covered it. It was good stuff. Very impressive.
With that being said, guys, thank you so much for joining us. As always, we'll see you all next time. Have a good one.